The second President of the United States of America. John Adams, 1797 to 1801. The names, biographies and achievements of the Presidents of the United States since its founding? We continue the second President of the United States of America. John Adams, 1797 to 1801. Part 1. John Adams, the second President, was a leading advocate of American independence from Great Britain. He played a key role in negotiating the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. His presidency was marked by the quasi-war with France and the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. Despite his unpopularity due to these acts, Adams is also credited with helping to establish the United States Navy. John Adams, October 30, 1735 to July 4, 1826, was an American statesman, attorney, diplomat, writer, educator, and founding father who served as the second President of the United States from 1797 to 1801. Before his presidency, he was a leader of the American Revolution that achieved independence from Great Britain. During the latter part of the Revolutionary War and in the early years of the new nation, he served the U.S. government as a senior diplomat in Europe. Adams was the first person to hold the office of Vice President of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. He was a dedicated diarist and regularly corresponded with important contemporaries, including his wife and advisor Abigail Adams and his friend and political rival Thomas Jefferson. A lawyer and political activist prior to the Revolution, Adams was devoted to the right to counsel and presumption of innocence. He defied anti-British sentiment and successfully defended British soldiers against murder charges arising from the Boston Massacre. Adams was a Massachusetts delegate to the Continental Congress and became a leader of the Revolution. He assisted Jefferson in drafting the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and was its primary advocate in Congress. As a diplomat, he helped negotiate a peace treaty with Great Britain and secured vital governmental loans. Adams was the primary author of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, which influenced the United States Constitution, as did his essay Thoughts on Government. Adams was elected to 2 terms as vice president under President George Washington and was elected as the United States' second president in 1796. He was the only president elected under the banner of the Federalist Party. Adams's term was dominated by the issue of the French Revolutionary Wars, and his insistence on American neutrality led to fierce criticism from both the Jeffersonian Republicans and from some in his own party, led by his rival Alexander Hamilton. Adams signed the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts and built up the Army and Navy in an undeclared naval war with France. He was the first president to reside in the White House. In his bid in 1800 for re-election to the presidency, opposition from Federalists and accusations of despotism from Jeffersonians led to Adams losing to his vice president and former friend Jefferson, and he retired to Massachusetts. He eventually resumed his friendship with Jefferson by initiating a continuing correspondence. He and Abigail started the Adams political family, which includes their son John Quincy Adams, the 6th president. John Adams died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. New Englanders Adams and his son are the only presidents of the first 12 who never owned slaves. Historians and scholars have favorably ranked his administration. John Adams was born on October 30, 1735, to John Adams Sr. and Susanna Boylston. He had 2 younger brothers, Peter and Elihu. Adams was born on the family farm in Braintree, Massachusetts. His mother was from a leading medical family of present-day Brookline, Massachusetts. His father was a deacon in the Congregational Church, a farmer, a cordwainer, and a lieutenant in the militia. Adams often praised his father and recalled their close relationship. Adams's great-great-grandfather Henry Adams immigrated to Massachusetts from Braintree, Essex, England, around 1638. Adams's formal education began at age 6 at a dame school, conducted at a teacher's home and centered on the New England primer. He then attended Braintree Latin School under Joseph Cleverly, where studies included Latin, rhetoric, logic, and arithmetic. Adams's early education included incidents of truancy, a dislike for his master, and a desire to become a farmer, but his father commanded that he remain in school. Deacon Adams hired a new schoolmaster named Joseph Marsh, and his son responded positively. Adams later noted that as a child I enjoyed perhaps the greatest of blessings that can be bestowed upon men, that of a mother who was anxious and capable to form the characters of her children. At age 16, Adams entered Harvard College in 1751, studying under Joseph Mayhew. As an adult, Adams was a keen scholar, studying the works of ancient writers such as Thucydides, Plato, Cicero, and Tacitus in their original languages. Though his father expected him to be a minister, after his 1755 graduation with an A.B. degree, he taught school temporarily in Worcester, while pondering his permanent vocation. In the next 4 years, he began to seek prestige, craving honor or reputation and more deference from his fellows, and was determined to be a great man. He decided to become a lawyer, writing his father that he found among lawyers noble and gallant achievements but, among the clergy, the pretended sanctity of some absolute dunces. He had reservations about his self-described trumpery and failure to share the happiness of his fellow men. When the French and Indian War began in 1754, Adams, aged 19, felt guilty he was the first in his family not to be a militia officer. He said, "I longed more ardently to be a soldier than I ever did to be a lawyer." In 1756, Adams began reading law under James Putnam, a leading lawyer in Worcester. In 1758, he earned an A.M. from Harvard, and in 1759 was admitted to the bar. He developed an early habit of diary writing. This included his impressions of James Otis Jr.'s 1761 challenge to the legality of British writs of assistance, which allowed British officials to search a home without notice or reason. Otis's argument against the writs inspired Adams to the cause of the American colonies. In 1763, Adams explored aspects of political theory in 7 essays written for Boston newspapers. Under the pen name Humphrey Plowjogger, he ridiculed the selfish thirst for power he perceived among the Massachusetts colonial elite. Adams was initially less well known than his older cousin Samuel Adams, but his influence emerged from his work as a constitutional lawyer, his analysis of history, and his dedication to republicanism. Adams often found his own irascible nature a constraint in his political career. In the late 1750s, Adams fell in love with Hannah Quincy. He was poised to propose but was interrupted by friends, and the moment was lost. In 1759, he met 15-year-old Abigail Smith, his third cousin, through his friend Richard Cranch, who was courting Abigail's older sister. Adams initially was not impressed with Abigail and her 2 sisters, writing that they were not fond, nor frank, nor candid. In time, Adams grew close to Abigail. They were married on October 25, 1764, despite the opposition of Abigail's mother. The pair shared a love of books and proved honest in their praise and criticism of each other. After his father's death in 1761, Adams had inherited a 9 plus 1/2 acre 3.8 hectares farm and a house where they lived until 1783. John and Abigail had 6 children. Abigail known Nabby in 1765, John Quincy in 1767, Susanna in 1768, Charles in 1770, Thomas in 1772, and Elizabeth in 1777. Susanna died when she was 1 year old, while Elizabeth was stillborn. All 3 of Adams's sons became lawyers. Charles and Thomas were unsuccessful, became alcoholics, and died at a relatively young age. In contrast, John Quincy excelled and launched a political career, eventually becoming president himself. Adams rose to prominence leading widespread opposition to the Stamp Act. The act was imposed by the British Parliament without consulting the American legislatures. It required payment of a direct tax by the colonies for stamped documents, and was designed to pay for the costs of Britain's war with France. Power of enforcement was given to British Vice Admiralty courts, rather than common law courts. These Admiralty courts acted without juries and were greatly disliked. The act was despised for both its monetary cost and implementation without colonial consent, and encountered violent resistance, preventing its enforcement. Adams authored the Braintree Instructions in 1765, in a letter sent to the representatives of Braintree in the Massachusetts legislature. It explained that the act should be opposed since it denied 2 fundamental rights guaranteed to all Englishmen, and which all free men deserved: to be taxed only by consent and to be tried by a jury of one's peers. The instructions were a succinct and forthright defense of colonial rights and liberties, and served as a model for other towns. Adams also reprised his pen name Humphrey Plowjogger in opposition to the Stamp Act in August of that year. Included were 4 articles to the Boston Gazette. The articles were republished in the London Chronicle in 1768 as True Sentiments of America, or a dissertation on the canon and feudal law. He also spoke in December before the governor and council, pronouncing the Stamp Act invalid in the absence of Massachusetts representation at Parliament. He noted that many protests were sparked by a popular sermon of Boston minister Jonathan Mayhew, invoking Romans chapter 13 to justify insurrection. While Adams strongly opposed the act in writing, he rebuffed attempts by Samuel Adams, a leader in the popular protest movements, to involve him in mob actions and public demonstrations. In 1766, a town meeting of Braintree elected Adams as a selectman. With the repeal of the Stamp Act in early 1766, tensions with Britain temporarily eased. Putting politics aside, Adams moved his family to Boston in April 1768 to focus on his law practice. The family rented a house on Brattle Street that was known locally as the White House. He, Abigail, and the children lived there for a year, then moved to Cold Lane. Later they moved again to a larger house in Brattle Square in the center of the city. In 1768, Adams successfully defended the merchant John Hancock, who was accused of violating British Acts of Trade in the Liberty Affair. With the death of Jeremiah Gridley and the mental collapse of James Otis Jr., Adams became Boston's most prominent lawyer. Britain's passage of the Townshend Acts in 1767 revived tensions, and an increase in mob violence led the British to dispatch more troops to the colonies. On March 5, 1770, when a lone British sentry was accosted by a mob, 8 of his fellow soldiers reinforced him, and the crowd around them grew to several hundred. The soldiers were struck with snowballs, ice, and stones, and in the chaos the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 civilians, in the infamous Boston Massacre. The accused soldiers were arrested on charges of murder. When no other attorneys would come to their defense, Adams was impelled to do so despite the risk to his reputation. He believed no person should be denied the right to counsel and a fair trial. The trials were delayed so that passions could cool. The week-long trial of the commander, Captain Thomas Preston, began on October 24 and ended in his acquittal, because it was impossible to prove that he had ordered his soldiers to fire. The remaining soldiers were tried in December when Adams made his famed argument regarding jury decisions. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Adams won an acquittal for 6 of the soldiers. 2, who had fired directly into the crowd, were convicted of manslaughter. Adams was paid a small sum by his clients. According to biographer John E. Ferling, during jury selection Adams expertly exercised his right to challenge individual jurors and contrived what amounted to a packed jury. Not only were several jurors closely tied through business arrangements to the British Army, but 5 ultimately became Loyalist exiles. While Adams's defense was helped by a weak prosecution, he performed brilliantly. Ferling surmises that Adams was encouraged to take the case in exchange for political office. One of Boston's seats opened 3 months later in the Massachusetts legislature, and Adams was the town's choice to fill the vacancy. The prosperity of his law practice increased from this exposure, as did the demands on his time. In 1771, Adams moved his family to Braintree, Massachusetts, but kept his office in Boston. He noted, "Now my family is away. I feel no inclination at all, no temptation, to be anywhere but at my office." After some time in the capital, he became disenchanted with the rural and vulgar Braintree as a home for his family. In August 1772, he moved them back to Boston. He purchased a large brick house on Queen Street, not far from his office. In 1774, Adams and Abigail returned the family to the farm due to the increasingly unstable situation in Boston, and Braintree remained their permanent Massachusetts home. Adams, who had been among the more conservative of the Founding Fathers, persistently held that while British actions against the colonies had been wrong, open insurrection was unwarranted and peaceful petition with the view of remaining part of Great Britain was preferable. His ideas began to change around 1772, as the British Crown assumed payment of the salaries of Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his judges instead of the Massachusetts legislature. Adams wrote in the Gazette that these measures would destroy judicial independence and place the colonial government in closer subjugation to the Crown. After discontent among members of the legislature, Hutchinson delivered a speech warning that Parliament's powers over the colonies were absolute and that any resistance was illegal. John Adams, Samuel, and Joseph Hawley drafted a resolution adopted by the House of Representatives threatening independence as an alternative to tyranny. The resolution argued that the colonists had never been under the sovereignty of Parliament. Their charter, as well as their allegiance, was exclusive to the king. The Boston Tea Party, a demonstration against the Tea Act and the British East India Company's tea monopoly over American merchants, took place on December 16, 1773. Protesters demolished 342 chests of tea worth about £10,000 on the British schooner Dartmouth, anchored in Boston Harbor. The Dartmouth owners briefly retained Adams as legal counsel regarding their liability for the destroyed shipment. Adams applauded the destruction of the tea, calling it the grandest event in the history of the colonial protest movement, and writing in his diary that it was an absolutely and indispensably necessary action. In 1774, at the instigation of Samuel Adams, the First Continental Congress was convened in response to the Intolerable Acts, a series of deeply unpopular measures intended to punish Massachusetts, centralize authority in Britain, and prevent rebellion in other colonies. 4 delegates were chosen by the Massachusetts legislature, including John Adams, who agreed to attend, despite an emotional plea from his friend, Attorney General Jonathan Sewell, not to. Shortly after he arrived in Philadelphia, Adams was placed on the 23-member Grand Committee tasked with drafting a letter of grievances to King George III. The committee soon split into conservative and radical factions. Although the Massachusetts delegation was largely passive, Adams criticized conservatives such as Joseph Galloway, James Duane, and Peter Oliver, who advocated a conciliatory policy towards the British or felt that the colonies had a duty to remain loyal to Britain, although his views at the time aligned with those of conservative John Dickinson. Adams sought the repeal of objectionable policies, but at this stage he continued to see benefits in maintaining the ties with Britain. He renewed his push for the right to a jury trial. He complained of what he considered the pretentiousness of the other delegates, writing to Abigail, "I believe if it was moved and seconded that we should come to a resolution that 3 and 2 make 5, we should be entertained with logic and rhetoric, law, history, politics and mathematics, concerning the subject for 2 whole days, and then we should pass the resolution unanimously in the affirmative." Adams ultimately helped engineer a compromise between the conservatives and the radicals. The Congress disbanded in October after sending the petition to the king and showing its displeasure with the Intolerable Acts by endorsing the Suffolk Resolves, which called for a boycott of British goods. Adams's absence was hard on Abigail, who was left alone to care for the family. She still encouraged her husband in his task, writing, "You cannot be, I know, nor do I wish to see you an inactive spectator, but if the sword be drawn I bid adieu to all domestic felicity, and look forward to that country where there is neither wars nor rumors of war, in a firm belief that through the mercy of its king we shall both rejoice there together." News of the opening hostilities with the British at the battles of Lexington and Concord made Adams hope that independence would soon become a reality. 3 days after the battle, he rode into a militia camp and, while reflecting positively on the high spirits of the men, was distressed by their poor condition and lack of discipline. A month later, Adams returned to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress as the leader of the Massachusetts delegation. He moved cautiously at first, noting that the Congress was divided between loyalists, those favoring independence, and those hesitant to take any position. He became convinced that Congress was moving in the proper direction, away from Great Britain. Publicly, Adams supported reconciliation if practicable, but privately agreed with Benjamin Franklin's confidential observation that independence was inevitable. In June 1775, with a view of promoting union among the colonies against Great Britain, he nominated George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of the army then assembled around Boston. He praised Washington's skill and experience, as well as his excellent universal character. Adams opposed various attempts, including the Olive Branch Petition, aimed at finding peace. Invoking the already long list of British actions against the colonies, he wrote, "In my opinion powder and artillery are the most efficacious, sure, and infallibly conciliatory measures we can adopt." After his failure to prevent the petition from being enacted, he wrote a private letter derisively referring to Dickinson as a piddling genius. The letter was intercepted and published in Loyalist newspapers. The well-respected Dickinson refused to greet Adams and he was for a time largely ostracized. Ferling writes, "By the fall of 1775 no one in Congress labored more ardently than Adams to hasten the day when America would be separate from Great Britain." In October 1775, Adams was appointed Chief Judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court, but he never served and resigned in February 1777. In response to queries from other delegates, Adams wrote the 1776 pamphlet Thoughts on Government, which laid out an influential framework for Republican constitutions. Throughout the first half of 1776, Adams grew increasingly impatient with what he perceived to be the slow pace of declaring independence. In the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he helped push through a plan to outfit armed ships to launch raids on enemy vessels. Later in the year, he drafted the first set of regulations for the Provisional Navy. Adams drafted the preamble to the Lee Resolution of colleague Richard Henry Lee. He developed a rapport with Delegate Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who had been slower to support independence but by early 1776 agreed that it was necessary. On June 7, 1776, Adams seconded the Lee Resolution, which stated that the colonies were free and independent states. Prior to independence being declared, Adams organized a committee of 5 charged with drafting a Declaration of Independence. He chose himself, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert R. Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Jefferson thought Adams should write the document, but Adams persuaded the committee to choose Jefferson. Many years later, Adams recorded his reasoning to Jefferson. Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. The committee left no minutes, and the drafting process itself remains uncertain. Accounts written years later by Jefferson and Adams, although frequently cited, are often contradictory. Although the first draft was written primarily by Jefferson, Adams assumed a major role. On July 1, the resolution was debated in Congress. It was expected to pass, but opponents such as Dickinson made a strong effort to oppose it. Jefferson, a poor debater, remained silent while Adams argued for its adoption. Many years later, Jefferson hailed Adams as the pillar of the Declaration's support on the floor of Congress, its ablest advocate and defender against the multifarious assaults it encountered. The Congress disbanded in October after sending the petition to the king and showing its displeasure with the intolerable acts by endorsing the Suffolk Resolves, which called for a boycott of British goods. Adams's absence was hard on Abigail, who was left alone to care for the family. She still encouraged her husband in his task, writing, "You cannot be, I know, nor do I wish to see you an active spectator, but if the sword be drawn I bid adieu to all domestic felicity, and look forward to that country where there is neither wars nor rumors of war in a firm belief that through the mercy of its king we shall both rejoice there together." News of the opening hostilities with the British at the battles of Lexington and Concord made Adams hope that independence would soon become a reality. 3 days after the battle, he rode into a militia camp and, while reflecting positively on the high spirits of the men, was distressed by their poor condition and lack of discipline. A month later, Adams returned to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress as the leader of the Massachusetts delegation. He moved cautiously at first, noting that the Congress was divided between loyalists, those favoring independence, and those hesitant to take any position. He became convinced that Congress was moving in the proper direction, away from Great Britain. Publicly, Adams supported reconciliation if practicable, but privately agreed with Benjamin Franklin's confidential observation that independence was inevitable. In June 1775, with a view of promoting union among the colonies against Great Britain, he nominated George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of the army then assembled around Boston. He praised Washington's skill and experience as well as his excellent universal character. Adams opposed various attempts, including the Olive Branch Petition, aimed at finding peace. Invoking the already long list of British actions against the colonies, he wrote, "In my opinion powder and artillery are the most efficacious, sure, and infallibly conciliatory measures we can adopt." After his failure to prevent the petition from being enacted, he wrote a private letter derisively referring to Dickinson as a piddling genius. The letter was intercepted and published in Loyalist newspapers. The well-respected Dickinson refused to greet Adams and he was for a time largely ostracized. Ferling writes, "By the fall of 1775 no one in Congress labored more ardently than Adams to hasten the day when America would be separate from Great Britain." In October 1775, Adams was appointed Chief Judge of the Massachusetts Superior Court, but he never served and resigned in February 1777. In response to queries from other delegates, Adams wrote the 1776 pamphlet Thoughts on Government, which laid out an influential framework for Republican constitutions. Throughout the first half of 1776, Adams grew increasingly impatient with what he perceived to be the slow pace of declaring independence. I stop at this point today. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the world's incredible stories. Soon we will publish Part 2. Thank you for watching.